Okay, basically Al raised here in California and with a stone favored family, lapidary gem cutting business. I'm going to brief this out because he's done a lot. Okay. And then they moved and Fresno, California. He took the GIA course, became a GG, certified gemologist, the graduate gemologist certified. Oh, AGS, excuse me, and that, like me. And so they moved to Oregon, and they were there for a while in an appraisal service and serving a lot of different people there. And he had an interest in the quality of cut of a stone because he realized that's how you could bring out the personality of a stone. Actually, cut is everything. And so he came to GIA in the year 2000 and became a member of the American Gem Society Cut Task Force, which sounds kind of dangerous, it kind of has that spy thing to it, I think. But and he created basically the GIA's cut grading system. And it came through there were at least four different gems and gemology issues on cut, and the different aspects of cut. And I can remember Al approaching me in Tucson. Would you take this cut survey for me? I said, oh, come on, Al. But I did it. And so now terminology is certainly one that is important in the cut business. And Al ended up writing a book on the American cut, the first 100 years. Can anybody see this?
No, because I've got I'm doing the thing.
Oh, because you're doing the thing.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I was going to Vanna this for you, but not necessary. And I can remember Al showing me a ring that he had on, and
Elaine?
She froze.
So I am happy to say that for the years that I was at GIA, that I was able to connect with Al and bring him here again tonight. And I am more than happy to turn it over to the wonderful. Is there anything I missed about you, Al, that you want to include?
We're fine.
Okay,
I did not solely create the cut grading system. We had a team that worked on that, just to clarify. So.
Okay, but I couldn't remember the other people, so.
Oh, that's a whole team.
That's
so
okay.
That's okay.
A whole, well, the cut team, is
so,
GIA's team researching cut.
So let me get started
And
with the.
It's all yours.
Okay. And if somebody can't hear me, I assume you will tell them that you are not hearing me. So let's talk. We're going to talk about the evolution of diamond cutting and specifically focused on the round brilliant. And so just a little bit of things here. This presentation is copyright protected, so you can't really share it or reproduce it, but this group has been given permission to video it and will be offered again so you can find it through YouTube again. So just so that you're aware of that. Let me go back to early stones, talking about 6th century BC and before. The first diamonds were found in certain deposits in India. And both of those are natural diamond crystals. And you see a big difference between the two qualities there. The one on the left was very prized very early on. I'm talking about 6th centuries AD in India. And even before, they were actually writing about diamonds as early as the 4th century BC. But by the time of the 6th century and a little bit later on, those diamonds that were really clean and pure and colorless and really nice and glassy looking were prized. And if any diamond over 10 carats was automatically given to the Maharaja, meanwhile, everything else could be sold and traded. So that's kind of the early things about diamonds. That by 150 AD, some of these diamonds were already coming out of India into Rome and were put into Roman rings that you see pictured here. And so they were wearing these crystals in rings as early as 150 BC or 150 AD, excuse me. And the Indian gem cutters looked at these crystals. That shape that you see the crystals in is called an octahedron. It's like two pyramids put on each side, put together, joined in the middle there, and they've got 8 faces, and so it's octahedron. And these octahedrons were coming to Europe, going into jewelry in the 1200s, and they were chipping every now and then. And so they were having to learn how to repair them. And they started that by doing that with a iron plate, just a flat iron plate where they would grind up diamond dust, mix it with oil, and just, like just wiping it across there back and forth, trying to fix those facets that were chipped or abraded. Diamonds first appeared in royal inventories about 1280, and they were distinguished between made or and in terms of that was something that had been fixed by somebody, or they were natural diamonds. And so they were fixed by using diamond grit on an iron plate. So moving on, they would chip these tops of these stones in the rings. And after a while, they realized, that's just not cutting it. And so they would cut a flat facet on the top, and they called it a table cut. They added some corners to some of the braided corners and called it a single cut. And again, this is between 1300 and 1400 in Europe. There were several cutting centers by this time that were cutting diamonds, mostly for extremely wealthy people and powerful people and royalty. Of the upper rich, they couldn't even afford the diamonds. You had to be right at the top of the ladder, if you will, to afford a diamond then. By the 1400s, groups like the Medicis and other groups were using diamonds as a symbol of their power and their strength. Now this cut that you see over the right-hand side, this point cut, remember they were cutting these and fixing these stones, and they found that they could actually take a stone that was not well polished on the surface. They could polish them and imitate the really nice natural diamonds. And so they started doing that. But the only problem was they couldn't cut it at the same angles as that pyramid was on, because it kind of flaked off and stuff like that. So they had to either tilt the angles in a little bit or out a little bit. And so you see point cuts being really steep or being really shallow in comparison to the natural octahedron. Now, if you look closely at that picture, that point cut that's in that diamond ring there, that was a symbol of the Medici family, is very pointed and high topped. And that's one that's been recut by man, and it wasn't a natural diamond crystal at all. So about the 1400s, people started figuring out how to use treadle power to do different types of machinery. And so somebody took an iron circular plate and put it with a pedal and started grinding away these facets, and it got faster for them. By the 1600s, you see an apparatus like you see on the right where they've mechanized it further, and they've got water power driving it or something else. And so you see this mechanization going on of diamond cutting. About this time, in the 1500s, a guy out of Spain by the name of Juan Villafane that was the first really to talk about diamond value. And he talked about perfect cuts. He talked about how the perfect diamond is one that had certain proportions, and you see that proportion system in his drawing that was in his book. He also went into tables about prices and talking about if there was a broken angle, or if it was flawed, if it was yellow, or if it was blue. By the way, blue was worth very little then. Anything that was not colorless was worth less. And so they would talk about a 4 or 6 carat stone, for example, that was missing an angle or had some flaws in it, was only worth as much as a diamond of 1 carat that was really good value. And so they talked about the prices in that market at that time. They didn't change much. And so you have the first diamond pricing by cut, color, and clarity going on as early as 1572. And you see here some of these table cuts in a ring from that period of time. They don't look like much because they're not very sparkly, but they thought they were wonderful. About the same time, they figured out how on larger diamonds to cut off a piece of the stone that was not good for whatever reason. And they put oil and diamond powder on an iron wire and made a little groove by taking another diamond crystal and scratching a groove into the side of the diamond and drawing that wire back and forth by hand over a period of time until it cut off that other piece of diamond. And so they had a big piece that was good quality, or maybe they had a small piece that was good quality while the rest of it was less quality. And so they were doing a little bit of cutting by this method sometime in the 1500s. We have it written up by the middle of the 1500s as a good description of it. By the 1600s, they were playing with other types of facets. And this is probably one of the earliest faceted stones that had a brilliant type of style to it. You see the top on the left and the bottom on the right. So that bottom facet is quite large in the middle there. This is called the Wittelsbach. It was a blue diamond. It was cut prior to 1664, and it's one of the earliest brilliants there is. This picture is courtesy Graf Diamonds. They recut it recently into a modern style. About 1720, something happened that was very important. A major find of diamonds was found in Brazil, and this find changed the affordability of diamonds. All of a sudden, the general rich of the country could now afford diamonds. And so with all the glamorous balls and all the fancy finery that they had going on by the middle of the 1700s, everybody was decking out with gems and jewels, particularly diamonds. And people had tons of diamonds comparison to what they had. By tons of diamonds, this is still for the rich people. This isn't the common people. You had to have a lot of money still to buy a diamond. So you had these grand ballrooms from the mid-1700s, all lit by candlelight. And so these diamonds would just flicker and sparkle and glow and everything in the night. Well, interestingly enough, about the same time, a guy by the name of Frederick Strauss, who's a Parisian jeweler, found a way to apply metal to the back of glass, and which caused gem imitations to sparkle more than diamonds did. And so the metal behind the glass acted as a mirror and returned all the light coming into them. And so a lot of these balls, these people were wearing what we would call costume jewelry because it was sparklier than a diamond, because diamond cutting had not come to understand what angles needed to be used yet to get a really beautiful diamond. And so those diamonds you could see through very easily. They tend to be dark. Yes, they sparkled in terms of giving off fire underneath the candlelight, but they weren't as brilliant as these glass imitations. And so now we have more diamonds coming to the market. We have this competition from fake jewelry that diamond cutters are just going crazy with. And so they start experimenting with all kinds of cuts going forward from this. And so you see this assortment of cuts that were documented in the mid-1700s. And there's actually pages of these styles of cuts available where they're just playing with different facet arrangements to see what looks the best. And they want to create stones that are dynamic as what some of these glass imitations are. And so you see diamonds on belt buckles, on collars, pins, on buttons, all sorts of things, because as they danced and moved around at night, this is where the diamonds showed off. They wanted to see all that sparkle and glitter all over their bodies. Men wore tons of diamonds. Women started wearing diamonds much more so with this change that had happened. Now, during this time, the most popular cuts for diamonds were what you see on the right there, that what's called a rose cut, where it's flat on the back. And so it's not really returning light in the same way you and I would think of. Light would bounce into it and bounce back, but it was more sparkle off the surface of it, made it kind of glittery kind of a look to it. Rose cuts were one of the primary cuts that was very popular up through the early 1800s. The other cut was a brilliant style. Now, the brilliant style then was anything that had 58 facets like you see here. A guy by the name of David Jeffries wrote a really nice book in 1750. He rewrote it in 1751, rewrote it again in 1752, and rewrote it the fourth time in 1753 because different people were complaining about different things about that he wrote about. They felt that he was not doing good justice to the diamond trade in different areas, and so he kept explaining himself over and over and over. But these diagrams show what a diamond would look like most typically when it's cut from that octahedral shape of the diamond, because they want to recover as much weight as possible. So a good shape would yield this squarish look that we now would call a cushion shape. Now the angles, and he described the angles, they had to be 45 degrees on the crown and 45 degrees on the pavilion. And we know those angles now for those main facets would make a dead looking stone compared to what's being made today. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that. But this facet arrangement, this brilliant style cut, and the rose cut were the two most popular styles of cutting for a long time after this. The brilliant could be any outline, but this was the most common one. So you could have a brilliant that was round if the rough crystal yielded a round shape. So you could also have a pear shape or an oval shape if that's what the rough crystal yielded when it's shaped. So you saw other shapes, but primarily it was this because it was following that shape of the octahedral rough. And so here we have a piece cut from that period. You'll notice it's not a very pretty looking stone, but this would have been considered dynamic in those days. Notice that the girdle edge, that's the outside edge from on the side view, that's on the side to the right, is just, there's no thickness to it. It's a knife edge. And so typically those stones chipped very easily because of that nature. And the fact that this stone is still intact is a rarity. It's just very unusual. This stone actually has a little bit of a brownish tint, so it wouldn't have been as inexpensive as of a stone. So you kind of get this idea that things that have evolved from the point cut to the table cut to the single cut, and now we have these brilliants that could be round or they could be cushion shaped, depending on the shape of the crystal. So that kind of summarizes what happened between 1200 and 1750, and for that period in general. Now, John Ma finally showed us a diagram of how diamond cutters were figuring this out, because we kind of wondered, well, how do they figure out where 45 degrees is? Well, they simply had a little device that they called a compass, and the stone could rest at the top or the bottom against the compass, and they could make sure they were cutting to those angles. Well, some cutters followed that and some cutters didn't, because quite frankly, if I could get a 7-carat stone out of a 15-carat piece of rough rather than a 5-carat stone, I got more money because it's a 7-carat stone. Even if it's not cut as pretty, I could still sell it for more. And so people didn't always follow those angles that had been talked about in Jeffries. And so you see a little bit of it, which is what we looked at in that previous stone. The angles weren't quite right on and the shape wasn't that great because they're just following the shape of the crystal. And so they're trying to get the most out of that original crystal and get the most money for it when they sell it. So then we have in 1863, a monumental change. Brazil was starting to taper off in terms of its diamond production. And in 1863, diamonds were found in Africa. And when they were found, it was a huge amount of diamonds compared to what they had in Brazil. And so now diamonds got even less expensive for diamond cutters and diamond cutting firms. So they could acquire more diamonds more easily, and they could sell it now just not to the ultra rich, but to the rich, and even people who are just a better off could afford a small diamond even. And so in Kimberley is where they found that first diamond mine. And somebody wandering in a field found some diamond crystals, and pretty soon the rush was on, and they had thousands of people digging holes in the ground looking for diamonds. So about 1840, so that's just before this find down in South America, in South Africa. 1840, a large cutting firm was built. This is actually a drawing of a diamond cutting factory. You'll notice it has 4 floors to it on that one building. Every floor has diamond cutters working at it, or some part of the diamond cutting procedure going on. And this was one of the largest diamond cutting factories in the world at that time. It was Coster's, C-O-S-T-E-R. Inside, you saw these huge banks where they were getting power from the mill, from the water going by. And you see over to the back on the left-hand side, just one cutter after another, where there's hundreds of diamond cutters lined up cutting diamonds. And so you have this mass production going on of diamonds. Now, I want to explain a little bit about the diamond cutting process. This is actually what a diamond cutter would be doing in those days, that term diamond cutter. He would take two diamond crystals, put them on the ends of two handheld sticks and rub them against each other to shape the crystal to begin with, to get the outline of the finished stone, and also to get the outline of where the table should be and so on. And so what you would start out with is a crystal shaped like this, and just by rubbing the two sticks together for hours, they would end up with a shape like this. Now, there's no facets on it yet, but that's what the diamond cutter did. He ground away, and most diamond cutters, their hands and wrists went bad by the time they were 40, 45, 50, because of all that constant grinding and working with their hands. We think about some of the wrist injuries we have today, and these guys are doing the same thing day in and day out. It's kind of interesting because they were given a piece of rough, and they were given a locked box that they kept that piece of rough in, and they were supposed to grind that diamond down and make sure they captured all the dust from that diamond, and they were, as well as the finished pieces. And then that was weighed out at the beginning and the end of each day. And if there was any discrepancies, that was a big problem. Also, if they did not maximize the weight out of that crystal, they were also likely to lose their job and be going somewhere else in the factory. The diamond cutter was actually one of the critical people because he set the outline for where what the stone should be like, and set the optimum weight recovery from that crystal. So his job was to get as much weight recovery as he could and make this shape that could be polished to a finished diamond. And so we have a stone here. It's kind of a pear-ish shape, but he's following the edge of the crystal. It was actually set in a little bit of a gold bezel, so there's a little bit of edge around it. But as you can see right now, this is not an attractive shape by today's standards, but that was the shape of that particular crystal. And when you look at the stone from the side, you see that the crown, which is the top part of the stone, is actually thicker than the pavilion, which is the bottom part of the stone, because you can see barely the point of the culet sticking out at the bottom. And so where those red lines are shows you what the outline is. So this crystal was shaped so that there isn't much, you're looking through the stone because it's so shallow and you don't see any reflection at all. But we're talking about trying to recover the most weight possible out of these crystals from this period of time. This is actually a very famous diamond called the Dresden Green. And so it weighs, I think, 16 carats. It has a little green tone to it. It's one of the first large green diamonds, natural green diamonds that was ever cut. And so but they wanted to recover as much weight as possible out of it. So the next person after the diamond cutter was a diamond setter. He would take this stone that the diamond cutter gave him, and he would shape molten lead into a mound and push that diamond rough form into the molten lead, so parts of it were sticking out. Those parts then would be polished by hand by the diamond polisher in the next steps. But his job was to take and, using his bare fingers, push around lead that was hot enough that could be formed by his hands. There was a guy that was a grandfather of somebody I knew back in New York a few years back, whose job had been to be a diamond setter back around 1900. And his grandfather had no touch or feel in his fingertips for his thumb and his forefinger, because of all those years of working with the hot lead. He could do what he was supposed to do with this, but he had no touch or feel in those fingertips. All the nerves had been burned out over all those years. So finally, the diamond polisher takes that, and he's got a way to hold that stick that diamond is stuck to the end of that in that lead, and he's polishing away, and he polishes the individual facets. The diamond setter moves that stone around for him at different locations, and he goes to polishing new facets, and so they end up polishing all the different facets that are on the stone that way. And so you see in the 1870s, 1850s to 1870s, this piece is actually made about 1870. You'll see a variety of shapes. You'll see those cushion shapes all vary a little bit. You'll see some round shapes, that these are all the shapes of what those crystals would have looked like. And so consequently, they made the most out of the weight recovery they could out of those original crystals. Now, a guy by the name of Henry Morse, and this is his business card, in 1870, had been looking at diamond cutting and really was interested in diamond cutting. And so he bought some equipment and started to do some cutting, and somebody walked into his shop and who had been a diamond cutter over in Belgium. And he had some other friends who had been diamond cutters. And so he tapped into these guys and he started a diamond cutting business. Now, he had another guy who helped him with that business, who built all the machinery. His name was Charles Field. And as Charles worked with Henry Morse, he realized that part of the problem was this outlining of the diamond, this diamond cutting, which is also called bruting. More recently, we call that bruting rather than cutting. But so he made a machine that could brute or outline the stone and grind away and make the outline shape that we wanted, so he could make perfectly round stones. And he could make and do this very quickly. So instead of taking sometimes with a large stone days to brute it, he could brute it in a half a day or less. And so it cut down on time and made it the symmetry more perfect. And he patented this machine in the early 1870s. But Henry Morse was also trying to understand a little bit more about how diamonds looked and why some looked good and why some didn't look so good. And so, and here's a picture of that diamond bruting machine. It's actually on file with the patent office. And so he started measuring the angles of the different diamonds that looked good and the ones that looked bad to try and figure out what angles work best to make a diamond look good. What a concept. He thought, well, maybe we're using the wrong angles, because certain stones look really brilliant and fiery and they look very attractive. Others don't. And so it's kind of interesting here. And so he started tracking all the angles and figuring out which angles work best and trying to get his cutters, who were all from Belgium and of the old school, to change over to what he thought should be better angles. Well, they didn't like this new machine that made things perfectly round. They didn't like these angles so much. And so they fought with him over this. And meanwhile, he started teaching some young Americans how to do the diamond cutting. He and Charles Field set up a shop across town. This is in Boston, by the way. Set up another shop across town and started teaching these young Americans how to do diamond cutting. And as he got into more and more discussions with his Belgium cutters, they went on strike. They got really upset with him because he was insisting on them doing certain things his way, and they didn't want to do it. They've always done this traditional fashion, and so he was not getting along with them well, and they went on strike. And he said, fine, and he said, I've got another shop set up, and he left them all behind. A couple of them came back, or actually never left him, and they stayed with him for years. During this period of time, he was given a large diamond piece of rough. It was actually a 125 carat piece of rough. You see a sketch there that Henry Morse made of the rough and then of the finished diamond. And he talks about the angles used for cutting it. And it was a yellow diamond. It was come out of Africa. And so here's a picture of Henry Morse. He got upset with these guys, remember, that were cutting for him. And he wrote, and there was an article where they interviewed him at one of the local papers. And he said, oh my, shopping for diamonds by the carat is like buying a racehorse by the pound. The Dutch, referring to these Belgian cutters, invariably work by the piece. The more they finish within a given time, the more money they make. Consequently, the work is slighted. The stones are thick, clumsy, ill-shaped, with beauty being sacrificed for weight. Well, that made them even more mad at him. And so it just created more issues. Morse had a journal that he kept of all of his business letters, over 1,000 business letters that we now have. Here's a letter he wrote in 1880 where he discusses some of the bottom angles, what we call pavilion angles. And we have lots of other angles lots of other letters that then discuss how he approached cutting. So we know lots about what Morse did. We also know some of the problems he had with his cutters and other issues. Morse passed away in 1888, but by then there was almost 500 diamond cutters working in the US trying to copy what Morse was doing. And in fact, Tiffany and Company had enticed some of Morse's best cutters to come work for them and set up a shop in New York. And so on the front page of Scientific American in 1891, you see this picture using a later version of that brooding machine. And one of the former cutters from Morse is pictured here doing diamond cutting. And this article goes on to talk about how diamond cutting is coming into its own within the US. Well, one of the problems that cutters had is let's take a look at the stone on the left. There's the octahedral crystal, but there's a stone within it. Underneath the traditional angles that were used, they got more weight recovery out of that crystal than the one on the right. The one on the right represents the angles that Morse was using. And so you can see there's a lot more loss of weight out of that crystal. And so a lot of cutters around the world did not like this because they were wasting diamonds. And so that kind of created an interesting sidebar. A guy came along and came up with a saw that could cut through, and so they could actually save the top of that diamond. And so you see here where if he were to cut through, and he could actually cut 2 diamonds through it. And so looking at it a little bit differently, there's the black is on both these outlines is the new shape, the red is the old shape. But now because you can cut 2 diamonds out of that one crystal, they are back to getting more weight recovery out of it, and the cutters are now again happy. So all of a sudden, everybody has diamond saws, and everybody's following this new patterning, and everybody's following these new angles, and diamond production is really strong. And so here you see examples of that early shaped diamond that followed a kind of an ovalish or a cushiony shaped crystal, but now you have the one on the right, which is the modern proportions, and it's perfectly round. And you kind of see the differences between those 2 diamonds there. So about that same time, because American cutters were doing all this stuff and European cutters were going, we don't know if we like the American style or not. And they called it American styles of cutting. Well, the Americans loved it because they took out ads in trade journals and said, American supremacy. And they talked about how much better the round diamond with these new angles was, and how much better it was than the cutting that came out of Europe. And so that all these cutting factories are set up in the US were now selling even more diamonds because of all the advertising going on about how much more beautiful these diamonds were. And the public was loving it because these diamonds did look better. And so they were bringing in their old diamonds, they were having them recut into this new shape. And here's that picture of that saw that cut diamond crystals from that period. So with the advent of that saw, they could really get the best recovery out of those crystals. And so it just tied in perfectly with these changes in these angles and this new direction in cutting. Well, you saw all kinds of ads then, like this one on the left, Liberty, enlightening the world. Of course, this is talking about these best cut diamonds. Or you see this take on the American diamond talking about a baseball diamond. And you see there's a catcher there at the point on the bottom, along with a batter and a bat laying on the ground. And you see people running around bases and fielders. And it goes on to talk about the American diamond and how great it is, and ties it to the American pastime of baseball playing. Well, during this time, one of these companies that was really talking about and producing these ads and so on like that, also in their catalog provided discussions about why this cutting was so important at all the correct angles, so that jewelers could get educated about why this was important. So if I was a diamond buyer working with this company, I had a page that explained to me why these angles were good. It didn't have just pictures of diamonds. It had a page that explained why this cutting style was so important and why it was so much better. By early 1900s, they were doing what we call ray tracing. That is, they had an outline of a diamond. They took what they knew about optics of a diamond, and they kind of figured out, okay, if light comes in from this angle and goes out that angle, what angles are going to work best to create a good looking diamond. And all these early ray tracing designs that they came up with kind of validated what Morse had done. And so people said, oh, well, this even makes scientific sense. And so they started calling them scientific diamonds as well. They called them American cut. They called them ideal cut. They called them scientific diamonds. Those are just some of the names that were going on. Over here to the left, you see a full-size poster that jewelers could have in their stores that talked about fire, brilliancy, snap, and life. And it talked about why certain angles were the best. And so they could explain to their customers why cutting was so important. My page is going slow on my computer. So here's a close-up, but it talks about these angles, again, and this perfect roundness and why that's also important. Now, about this same time, about 1915, a guy by the name of Frank Wade started writing articles for Jeweler Circular, Keystone, and other major trade magazines about why cut was so important, also explaining color and its effect on value of diamonds and what flaws and clarity was, and then about repairing and recutting diamonds. And you can just see the list here. He wrote articles almost every month that year that explained diamonds and some new facet for the trade to understand. So we had this education going on of the trade through this major trade magazine. It was one of the most, it was a very large trade magazine. It dominated the trade at that point in time. Frank Wade took all those articles and put it into a book the following year. And he has this picture where he talks about the angles and everything, again, following Morse pretty much. And that diamond creates a beautiful looking diamond compared to what people had been seeing. And so they are very energized by all this in the trade. Now, the following year, a guy by the name of Herbert Whitlock, and he was an American mineralogist. He was the curator of minerals and gems at the American Museum of Natural History. He produced a series of articles for different shapes, including colored stones, doing ray tracing, showing how different cutting styles would look different and why certain angles were best. And so here's his image of what diamonds angles should be best, also coinciding with what Morse had said and what Wade had said, just with some slight differences. These are again called now the American cut, the scientific cut, or the ideal cut. Wade and Whitlock both said that the crown angles need to be at 35 degrees. And remember, the old thing I told you was at 45 degrees, so they did change quite a bit. The pavilion angle, which is the bottom side, needed to be at 41, which is also different from 45. If you stick with the 45 on both, you have a stone that you kind of see through, and it's kind of dark looking, and it's just not as lively as these new angles. The table, which is that top center facet, they said should be about 40%. Now, meanwhile, that catalog I talked about said that the angles for their stones, the crowns were between 35 and 37, the pavilion was between 40 and 42, and the tables that they were showing, they never talked about it in a specific number, but the tables they were showing in their catalogs were between 40 and 50% as diagrams that they shared. So this is what the American cut diamond was, and people in Europe referred to it as the American cut. That's those Americans. There was kind of a snide way of looking at it. They think, well, it wastes a lot of rough and stuff like that. We still don't, but we're cutting it because America wants it. So we're cutting this new style of cut. And so a lot of the cutting factories had to move to this to supply America because there was a high demand in America for this style of cutting. European countries were much slower in adopting this style of cutting, although they were starting to. In 1919, a guy by the name of Marcel Tolkowski came along, and he wrote a book. He was actually an engineering student in London, but his book sought to explain different angles and why they were best. His father had a huge company up in Belgium doing diamond cutting, and he averaged the angles of 5 diamonds that were the best looking that were from his company, and concluded that certain angles were the best ones. And amazingly, they were right in the same range that we were talking about all along, except the table was a little bit larger. He said the table needed to be 53%. Now, he provided a whole bunch of mathematical trig and stuff like that in his book to explain why these were the best. People who have examined that math since then say, well, it's not quite that simple, and there are some errors he's made. And so it's not as right as it needs to be, but generally speaking, it's pretty good. But he came up with a larger table at 53% during this time. Hang on a second. There we go. So in 1920, remember Wade? He's still writing articles all the time for Jeweler Circular Keystone. And so he embraces Tolkowski's little book that he talks about. And he talks about diamond design and talks about how, wait a minute, maybe we've got it wrong. And the tables need to be not 40 to 50%, but maybe 53% or even a little larger. And so he wrote a series of articles and kind of touted Marcel's book. And all of a sudden, everybody is cutting these slightly larger table stones. Interestingly enough, let me show you this bar pin. I was working on this book at one point that this is all from, and I had a friend come from Hood River call me up and said, Al, I've got this bar pin made by Tiffany and Company. From what I can tell, it was made in the mid 1920s, and you would be amazed at these stones. They're all perfect little soldiers. Every one of them has a 53% table. Every one of them seems to have the exact right angles. Was Tiffany cutting these stones? Well, Tiffany did have a cutting house then, and they were sending out for cutting, and this was their standard. So all of these are matched up perfect little soldiers, as you will, as he called them, all at the 53% table, all exactly this perfect ideal cut from that period. So it's an example of what that standard was, and Tiffany was selling it through their store. There you can see the Tiffany and Company stamp. It's a nice little platinum brooch from the mid 1920s from the style, you can tell. So here's just a close-up picture of those. You'll notice that they don't look quite the same as our modern round brilliants, and there's also a little circle in the middle. Those are about to change. So by the 1930s and 40s, the girdles, remember we talked about that knife edge girdle just so thin, became thicker so they didn't chip as easily. So they went from a knife edge, like on the left, to a little bit of a girdle so they don't chip as easily. They changed the what are called a lower half facet. It's a lower facet. It's not the main facet. It's a small facet on the bottom, and they lengthened them so that they were actually breaking up light a little bit better. They also made the culet, which is that bottom little tiny facet, they made it so it was almost invisible except on magnification. Or they brought it to completely to the point. Now, they like to have a little culet facet because they thought it helped minimize chipping of the culet. And so it still existed in most of those stones from that period, but it got smaller so you didn't see it so easily. So between the 30s and 40s, these things just morphed that direction because people liked those stones better. No one single person caused that. It was being done on different scales everywhere else, and people would see those stones and go, "Oh, I like that," and they would start copying those variations and changes because diamond cutting has became a worldwide event, or there were diamond cutting factories all over, and so they would see these things and they would make these modifications. In the 1940s, GIA introduced the concept of what they called the 4 C's: color, clarity, cutting, and carat weight. Now, we saw clear back in 1572, these were still the value factors for diamonds clear back then. And so GIA just said, this is what they are. And they called it the 4 C's. And that term is what they coined, but it actually had been in use all along. And so here they talk about ideal cutting and how it affects value as well. And so they embraced Tolkowski's 53% table and so on. So you get the idea and so the 1940s GIA introduces this concept, and they embrace what Tolkowski is doing. They teach this through their classes, and that kind of sets the standard for a number of years. I'm going to jump way ahead because in Japan in about 1980, a guy by the name of Kazumi Okuda adapted a microscope to evaluate cut by its reflection pattern when he used a red filter. And basically you see how there's something right there underneath that looks like a white beam of light or white area of light right there. Well, he painted that all red also, and that could be interchanged. And when it was all red, he got these types of images like you see on the right. And he could evaluate using that red reflector which diamonds were best looking and which were not by the pattern. And he said, oh, if I have a diamond that looks like this one up a higher where there's lots of white in it, when I look at those two out in the real world, it doesn't look nearly as lively as the one on the right. And so he started teaching how to evaluate a diamond using this reflector. Now, by the 1990s, we have these little handheld devices that were looking at what were called hearts and arrows in Japan. About the mid 1990s, these started coming into the US through some of the diamond dealers that were buying some of these stones out of Japan. And so you saw these hearts and arrows, which have this high precision of cutting and giving these perfect little patterns. And so this kind of affected cutting for a while, and it became a standard amongst a group of people. Now, during all this time, people are trying to figure out how to look at a diamond, measure it, figure out what are its best, what are the best ones, and give a way of evaluating it, a way of understanding what they've cut, a way of designing better diamonds. There's all this going on in their background. And so this company out of Israel, it's now called Serene. It used to be called Sarin without the E on it. When sarin gas became a big issue, they decided they would add an E so that it would not be confused. And so they created this scanner that rotated a diamond on a platform and looked at its silhouette with a high magnification camera and could measure all the angles within a tenth of a degree. And so that's really pretty good precision for that type of thing. And so they would be able to measure all the angles and then say what each diamond's proportions were very exactly. Now this created a new standard because people could now cut to very high precision. They needed to figure out how to get to that though from the mechanical side. They could be measured. How do we get there? And so development started going that direction now. In 1999, this type of environment was, remember how we talked about the red reflector? Well, make that reflector over the diamond multicolored, and so that there's a multi-bands of color, if you will, black being in the center, then a little bit of red, and then green, and then the two shades of blue going further out. What that told people, now let's think about this a little differently. If I think about this stone down here on the bottom and what I'm seeing in that reflection pattern, if I'm looking at the real diamond, I'm blocking light, aren't I? So my head has a certain width to it when I'm holding it at maybe 18 inches away or 15 inches away from the diamond. And so I'm blocking a little bit of light. And so light is not coming through my head. Light is coming from these green and blue areas above the diamond. But where you see the red and black here, that's actually blocking light. And so when I see this reflection here of red, that's really the dark reflection we were seeing in the diamonds that were hearts and arrows. And so it's giving me an idea that I can actually predict how much light I get from this green area and darker blue, because that's going to be the brightest light. Lower angle light isn't good. So I want to make a diamond that has this type of pattern if I put it into a computer and simulate this kind of thing. And so we have this kind of environment being built and suggested. And we have in the same year a company that comes out of Moscow, Russia, that creates this software called DiamCalc. And it takes all these measurements from the Serene measuring device and puts it into a diamond, and it can tell you what the diamond looks like in a number of different environments. It has all the angles over here, and you can adjust the angles to see how it changes the appearance. What a novel concept. Well, they then, the following year, introduced this type of lighting environment into their program. So now they can produce this type of thing. And they also make it so that the person working with a new design of cut can vary these angles and see which angles then look best. And so we want to have a lot of green. We want to have a little bit of this darker blue. We want to minimize the red here. So they understand these design principles and they start working on different diamond cuts. And so here we have a design for a cushion shape that was designed within DiamCalc using this type of thing. And I want to show you, see, as the stones tilt, now the DiamCalc produces all these images, it produces these movies, it gives tools to diamond cutters that they never had. So by 2004, they can produce these things. They can look at and figure out how to produce a good looking diamond. They can see as it tilts whether it keeps enough of the pattern or whether it starts getting too much leakage, which is that white. And they can compare different styles of cutting and figure out which ones are the best looking diamonds, given what type of rough they have to work with. Well, this changes diamond cutting again. And in the same year, they came up with this scanner. We're already looking at the scanning a finished diamond. Well, they come up with what's called an M-box scanner, and it actually takes a look at the inclusions in the, it looks at the outside exterior of the diamond, and it can map where all the different indentations are in the diamond crystal. This is a real diamond crystal. And so then they can use programming to see what the best recovery is out of that crystal. And so the same, within 2 years, they are also taking a look at from 3 different positions on the camera on the right, looking at what that's inclusion and mapping and putting that flaw into their 3D model, and then working around it so as to avoid flaws in their finished stones, figure out what's the best cut is so they can understand how to plan a diamond from the rough by doing all these different scans. So now they can figure out how to make the really good looking diamond. They can figure out how to minimize its flaws. They can figure out how to work with that piece of rough to maximize its usefulness. So here's an example of a piece of rough that's been scanned, and all those flaws are real flaws in that crystal. And what they do then is their program takes and makes a list of possibilities of how to cut it. And I want to show you these different possibilities, because all these different things here are different possibilities of different shapes and different weights, but they have involved here. So the original crystal is 3.12 carats. They say they can get in this solution, they can get an emerald cut and 2 radiant cuts out of it, a total weight recovery of carat 62. And based on what that company sells, those colors and clarities of stones, they can recover $2,543 out of that piece of rough. So they can get an emerald cut that's 1.02 carats. They'll get $1,971, and it will be an HVS2 clarity. They can get 2 radiant cuts, a 43 pointer and a 17 pointer. They're H color and internally flawless each, and getting another $464 and $108. So that comes up with that total of $2,543. Well, as you see, there's a whole bunch of different solutions. Maybe they don't sell radiance. And so they want to look at some other shape, like this one's a brilliant and a marquee, and they can get $2,400 out of it. Well, maybe that's a better business model for them, and so they'll go to that cutting solution instead. But they will get 100 or so different cutting solutions, and so they will examine it, determine which gives them the best value for what they are wanting, and understand what they need to do to get from here to there. Now, the other thing I want to show you here, notice how there's lines in this crystal. That doesn't show it there. But there's lines right here that are drawn across that crystal. That's where they're going to saw it to get those 3 stones out. So, and we'll come back to that in a second. So now they take these plans and they put them into automated cutting machines. So each machine that you see here is actually cutting 4 diamonds at the same time. Each diamond is planned by this method and has its own program cutting that stone to what it needs to be cut to. Now, here's a very interesting application of all this. In 2006, that's when this technology is brand new to diamond cutting trade. A 603 carat was found at the Lesotho mine in South America, or South Africa, excuse me. It was called the Lesotho Promise. It was 603 carats. It was a D color, but you can see there's lots of little flaws in it. So they used this planning software and they worked around all these flaws you see in the stone. They got this 43 carat heart out of it, for example. In fact, they yielded 26 stones out of it, recovering 233 carats. Each of them were D flawless. There was not a single flaw in any one of the finished diamonds. There was a 76 carat pear shape, 43 carat heart, 27 carat round, 20 carat emerald, and a bunch of other stones as well. These were, and there's a picture of that suite. and they were all put into a single final necklace. Finally, in the last few years, since 2008, they've been analyzing the spectrum of colored diamonds. This is a colored spectrum of a pink diamond. Well, they've figured out that certain faceting arrangement intensify the color. So now you can take and measure the spectrum from several different angles of the diamond. You can take those that have a hint of pink or yellow or blue or whatever, and figure out how to orient the rough, work around the flaws, and intensify the color through this program. Again, through variations of DiamCalc and its sister software. So that now you see how diamonds have come from this early flat plate, just trying to fix some facets that were broken, to modern cutting to try and get these modern round brilliants that we have and other modern shapes. And you kind of see the overall history of diamond cutting, as you will. And I can't believe I actually got through the whole program in the time lot. So we can unmute yourselves and we can talk about questions. I don't see any chat questions. I say, oh, there's 4 there. Okay. Could I recommend some book titles on the history? Well, I have to play my own book. And Elaine mentioned it earlier. It's called American Cut, the First 100 Years.
This
It's
one right here.
What's that?
It's right here. Can you see me?
Yes.
Can you see what also you get in here? You get a,
they have run out of those posters, Elaine.
okay, never mind.
We
How
used to
about,
have,
if you will,
so, but
how
that,
about this?
I can't tell what it is.
You can't see what it is. It is a t-shirt. Oops. It is a t-shirt that says Ideal Proportions. It's Tolkowski, or the American Cut, that we used to sell in the bookstore that I still happen to have.
Okay.
I used to, when I was teaching the Tolkowski cuts, I would just put this up on the board. I would just clip it up there and I said, here are these. I don't have to draw them, you know.
So for a book, I would go to that one. There's also a very good book out by Jack Ogden, simply called Diamonds.
Oh, that's a new one.
It's about 3 years old, 4 years old. It talks
Relatively, yeah.
It talks about early cutting history and early trade history. So if you
It's
want to go
beautiful.
before my book, you would probably want to go to that book. It's a hardbound. It's a pretty thorough book. So other questions?
Al, I have a question for you. This is Marjorie.
How you've changed.
Yes, I have.
COVID.
And how she's changed as well. So anyway, if you went back 40 years ago, you know, different diamond centers had different specialties. So there was Amsterdam, Antwerp, Tel Aviv, North America, New York, and then maybe India, where you had these cutting centers that specialized in certain types of stones and cutting expertise. I would imagine that with the automation now that's come with these machines, that's less of an issue, that almost any place around the world could maximize the yield on a diamond. Is that correct?
Well, it's partially correct. There are still a lot of cutters in the world that think that being cut by hand is more important than being cut by machine. And so while the vast majority of diamonds are indeed cut by machine on a large scale and in certain cutting centers, there are a lot of cutters who are still cut stones themselves. You'll see a single diamond cutter can set anywhere from 4, 5, 6 stones on the wheel at one time if he pays careful attention to them. So you still find cutters cutting individual stones in that fashion. And you find different people have different types of expertise. There are several companies that have expertise in cutting hearts, for example, which are a difficult stone to cut. There are several companies that cut princess cuts specifically as their specialty. And so you still have specialties going on. but it has become much more diverse, and people cut lots of different things now that didn't used to cut all those different types of things.
And then as a person that obviously you see a lot of diamonds go through the back operations for appraisal, is there any guidance that you can give to us, the American public, on how to kind of look at a diamond that might be offered to us at retail?
Oh, that would take another whole session.
Well, I've got a couple hours, so.
Well, I'm going to make it very brief. You should always be comparing diamonds to other diamonds.
Okay.
Otherwise, you have no way to know whether a stone really is outstanding or not. Secondly, you should also always look at diamonds in at least 2 different types of environments, if not 3. One is diffused light. And diffused light is where light is basically coming off of a white ceiling, and fluorescent lighting that's not very spot-like. Mixed lighting is the next type of lighting environment where you have some single spots up in that white diffused lighting, or spot lighting. Spot lighting is like going to a lounge where all they have is just single bulbs, and that makes diamonds look very fiery. And you'll see a lot of jewelry stores have those types of diamonds, or those types of lights right over their showcases, and they want their diamonds to look fiery. You got to get away from those cases because you don't understand necessarily what it's going to look like in other environments. What was that? Okay.
I just said lighting.
Yeah, so lighting, looking at different lighting is real important. As your lighting changes, your diamond appearance changes, and you want to make sure it looks good in the lighting that you're going to like. For example, somebody who works in an office all the time, I want to make sure it looks good in diffused lighting, because otherwise they'll just die in that diffused lighting office. So that's kind of important to look good in that type of lighting. Joe.
So using this criteria, you could also apply that to colored stones.
Oh, absolutely.
And get brilliance. A fellow cut a quartz that looked as good as a diamond.
Yep.
They can be cut very well. The other thing with color is different types of lighting have different wavelengths going on. And so if you look at a temperature that's very warm, a ruby will look great in that, but a sapphire won't. Versus other types of lighting that isn't as warm, the sapphire will look better, the ruby won't look as good. So different types of lighting change how different colored stones look too. So you need to kind of look at colored stones in different types of lighting, because it may not look as interesting in some of the lighting that you have to work in all the time, and then you might want it to look good at your job and so on. Like that's where you're going to wear it. Elaine?
Yeah.
Can you hear? My internet connection isn't working too well, and several times your talk has just gone in and out. But what about when you have bow ties? Have they improved on the cuts of certain shapes of stones to eliminate bow ties, or are they almost always there?
Two things about bow ties. There are actually people who like bow ties, so don't be too quick to denigrate them. There's
people who go to a lot of cocktail parties.
There's a lot of
bow ties.
Cutters there's a lot of cutters who have figured out how to minimize bow ties. There's several different diagrams that do that very well, and so you'll find a variety of different types of bow ties that are out there. Bow tie is basically that dark reflection across the middle of the stone, like an oval or a marquee, that looks like a bow tie. And it's the reflection of the person's face it's looking at it.
Wow. So I'm dark and angly. Okay, I'll buy that. But and also if you're looking at colored stones, no, that's only in matching bracelets. You don't have to worry about that. No, I don't. Pyramatic machines. Those are the older machines that used to cut more than one stone at the same time, right?
I don't know. There's actually a number of stones that cut more than one stone at the same time, and I don't know all the different brands that do that.
Well, and you mentioned that the different cutting sections now, it used to be like India, Antwerp, Israel, New York, and I don't even know if they cut in Russia anymore. That's not a cutting center, right?
Oh, Russia cuts a ton of diamonds.
They do still.
Oh yeah. Well, they don't come to the States so much because they're cutting for their own population.
Yeah, they've got to do that. They've got to do that. But India still, of course.
Yeah.
But it's almost like you said with that machine, you can cut, you know, certain almost any shape, but there are places that specialize because that's their thing.
And China is starting to do more cutting.
Ooh,
You don't like that.
yeah.
So there's
Okay.
a lot of cutting centers.
So is there a preferred shape now? Does it matter if it's a marquee versus a brilliant versus a cushion?
Preferred,
I think
not perfect.
I think statistically about 70% of the diamonds that come into GIA for grading are rounds, a round brilliant.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So statistically, I guess they're preferred.
Yep.
Marquees got very popular years ago, then they went quiet, then they got popular again, then they went quiet. I think they're quiet right now. So different shapes go through different popularity things. Princesses were very popular for a while, then they died down a little bit. I don't know what their popularity is right now. I know they're still around a lot. So different shapes go through different stages. Depends upon the designs also that work with these things, because as trends go with designs, they work more with certain types of shapes.
So one thing that the general public sees in vintage jewelry is a thing called a mine cut. And how does that relate to your timeline on which?
Well, okay, mine cut is usually a cushiony shape, and the mine cuts, that was that same stone that Jeffries was cutting in 1750, and those were cut clear up to 1920 in a number of cutting centers with that type of cutting. So it could have been cut anytime during that, and different variations on that cushion shape.
Mhm.
And then the old European cut, that's a rounder.
The old European cut as a round, they started being cut actually in 1813 is the first we have of where they're actually documented. But they weren't really round. They were just kind of
No.
more or less round.
Sort of.
Because they didn't have the brooding machine. After the brooding machine came into play, so that 1890s to 1900, then they became very popular, and a lot of the cutting centers used those to make those round shapes, because they remember now they can get 2 diamonds out of 1 crystal after the saw came out. So by 1910, those shapes which have a short lower half and have a bigger culet on the bottom, which are what some people call that, and actually they're more of a transitional cut. A transitional cut also has a misnomer going on, so it gets foggy because the trade calls some of these things different variations of the same thing. So it's
Yeah.
And then just as a percentage, when you're doing appraisal on the 4 Cs, how much does cut weigh into the final appraisal?
That's a different kind of question because it depends on what the market is doing. If cut is really important to certain parts of the segment, and they're extremely well cut, it adds a lot to it. Other types of the market, parts of the market don't care about cut, and we still have people cutting that don't care about whether it gets a good or even a fair cut grade. They're still selling stones in that range in certain segments of the market.
Wow.
So it affects the price, but popularity wise, there's segments that sell those.
And then maybe not a fair question, but in all your years that you've been around stones, what was your favorite stone that you've seen or touched or saw?
That's not even possible to answer. I think one of the stones that's a stone that I have a personal pride in, that I enjoy and I wear occasionally, is a synthetic diamond. It's yellow and it's cabbed.
Wow.
Is that the one that you did, Al?
Yes, but how many have seen a synthetic yellow diamond, much less that was cabbed? And would you recognize a cabbed diamond?
Wow.
Too hard. You
So
wouldn't know.
So I think it kind of stands out as something special, but it's really not that special.
It is to you.
A lot of people could do it. It's a very simple thing to do. Nobody cares to do it is all.
Well, because I'm in control of the Zoom meeting, if anybody has any other questions, please join in. Otherwise, it's me who has to shut this thing down. So,
We want
Al,
to
thank
thank you so much, Al.
Let's thank him. God.
yeah,
Oh, Terry, go ahead.
Oh, I just thought it was a fantastic presentation. There's
Yeah.
so much that I learned so much tonight. Thank you.
Good.
Absolutely.
Good.
Absolutely. And thank you. Thank you.
Right.
Oh,
Thanks,
wait,
everybody.
Mr. Apodaca has a question?
Oh, you have to
And
turn
I
on,
think
you're on mute. Joe, you're on mute.
Unmute yourself, Joe.
Boop. Because it's white.
Linda, help him.
Okay,
The question is, I know you like Oregon sunstones,
yes.
and I cut a sunstone that had silver schiller with a rainbow inclusion, and it came out to be cat's eye, a rainbow cat's eye.
Wow.
And I don't know if you've ever seen anything like that, or I have the only one.
I'm not the sunstone expert, so I couldn't, I don't know that I've ever seen one, but there's a lot of people who play with sunstone, but I'm not, I guess I would be talking to people over at the Ponderosa mine or someplace like that and see if they've seen anything like that.
Yeah, I know no one that I know has seen one.
I may be able to help you with that, you know, if you want to.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's a guy who has a mine out there, John, and Carla, you know, too. Carla Proud, she's with a sunstone mine in Oregon. There's like three main ones. And there was an article done in GIA about the Oregon sunstone. I forget how long ago, but
Yeah, that's
if
probably
you're
online.
welcome to ask me a time. And so,
Okay.
You can probably find that article online, Joe. If you go to GIA Gems and Gemology,
Yeah.
and also do a search for sunstone, it'll pull up articles. So GIA Gems and Gemology sunstone, and you should be able to find the article.
Okay, thanks.
Linda, didn't you work at GIA?
No,
Oh,
never.
different Linda. Sorry.
Can I ask a silly question?
Sure.
Okay, so as far as trends go with diamonds and the cuts, so we don't have as many magazines in print for girls to like look at diamonds and drool over what kind of cuts and stuff. They're just on little websites. Now, what do you think of this silly show called The Bachelor? Because they always have the diamond guy at the end and he shows the rings and he shows about 10 stones and the guys are all like, I don't know. But I think that's like an exposure that girls see, young girls see of diamonds. I mean, what do you think of that? I mean, so how much has trend really affect the price? That's actually what I want to know.
I have no idea because I'm just not involved with those types of things, and I've never seen The Bachelor, so I have no frame of reference for it. So
Watch at the end.
Yeah,
They pick
Rappaport.
diamonds. Yeah.
Rappaport or Gem Guide question.
yeah, I can tell you that trends come and go, and whatever the current trend is, wait 6 months, it'll change.
Yeah.
So
All right.
okay.
So,
Okay.
Anything else?
I think
So-
we're good. I'm gonna.
So Al, we want to thank you very much for this presentation tonight.
Sure, Gary.
I'm sure all of our members are going to be looking at it several times.
Excellent.
Way too much information. So thank you. It was a very good
Okay.
program.
Thank you so much. Okay, everybody, I'm gonna kill it right now.
thank you.
Thank
Have
you,
a
everybody.
wonderful evening.
Thank you, Al.
Yeah,
Thank you
thank you,
guys
so
Marjorie.
much.